Has anyone ever actually told you the harsh truth about life after 80? Not the polite well wishes at a birthday party, not the gentle essays about enjoying your golden years, but the truth, the things that unfold quietly, steadily, silently, without warning. One day you realize your life has shrunk. The calls stop coming regularly. Your calendar thins out. No one's abandoned you. But your presence is no longer a vital part of other people's rhythm. After 80, change doesn't come in a rush. It seeps in, through quiet gaps, through little habits that disappear before you even notice they're gone. Your body still works, but it's not as nimble. Your mind is still sharp, but the world starts talking to you like you're no longer the one making decisions. Things you used to do in minutes now take all morning and a bit of help. You don't always need help, but when you do, you're unsure. Should I ask? No one tells you that aging can feel like losing your sense of direction, not because you've lost your memory, but because you've lost the clear place you once held in other people's lives. This video doesn't try to fix everything. It's not here to sugarcoat anything or make you sad. It's just here to speak plainly and kindly. Some things really do change after 80, and you deserve to know them. Not to be afraid, but to see clearly. And from there to live this part of life actively, not passively waiting. Stay until the end of the video. Not because it's a sad story, but because in every piece of this truth, there's something worth hoping for. You still have choices. You still have the power to shape your life. And there are still so many things that can be meaningful once you realize you're not the only one going through this. And if you're ready, let's walk through what really happens after. Truth 1. The familiar circle shrinks, and you don't notice at first. The first thing you feel after turning 80 isn't back pain or shaky hands. It's absence. No one leaves all at once. There's no slamming door. It's just one day you suddenly realize the people who used to show up regularly now show up less, or not at all. A close friend moves in with their kids. A neighbor who once asked you to collect their mail now has someone else living in their house. A cousin who used to call every Sunday morning now doesn't. You don't blame anyone, because you know everyone has their reasons. Still, absence leaves an echo. You don't hear the phone ring as often. Calls are shorter now, more rushed. One time you thought about calling someone, then stopped, unsure if they even still have the same number. People you used to know well have become names you only mention in stories. And then, you start to remember the smallest things. A familiar joke no one brings up anymore. A seat in your regular cafe that no longer belongs to anyone. Someone who used to ask you once a month, "Everything okay?" No longer does. No one teaches you how to deal with this kind of loss. It's not losing a person. It's the slow fading of the connections that once made you feel like you were part of something bigger. At 60, you're still invited to weddings, parties, reunions. At 70, you're still on the call anytime list. But after 80, people start forgetting to add you to the group chat, not out of malice. Just because they think maybe you're no longer interested. There's a kind of loneliness that's different. It doesn't come from having no one around. It comes from fewer people really knowing you. You can be in a crowded room and still feel far away. No one asks you the kind of questions they used to. No one remembers what you've lived through, at least not the way you remember it. But once you understand this isn't anyone's fault, you can begin to do something new. Not to hang on to the past, but to create the present. You can write a handwritten letter, even if everyone else just texts. You can suggest a lunch date, even if you used to be the one who got invited. You can sit on your usual park bench and strike up a conversation with a stranger, as if you are the one opening the door, not waiting for someone to knock. Turning 80 isn't the time to stop connecting. It's the time to be more intentional about keeping your circles from disappearing altogether. And that takes a different kind of courage. Not the kind to move faster, but the kind to open up again. to not be afraid to reach out first, to believe that you still have a place in other people's lives, even if that place looks different than it used to. And you do have that in you, because if you've made it this far, you're strong enough to keep going in a new way. Truth 2, the body no longer recovers like it used to. After age 80, the most noticeable change isn't memory or vision. It's how your body recovers, or more accurately, how it no longer does. There's no more sleeping off a sore back. No more waking up the day after achy legs and walking like nothing happened. You begin to realize that some kinds of fatigue don't go away. They linger quietly, constantly, and force you to adjust how you live. You still get up, still walk around, still do the chores. But sometimes one wrong move, bending too low, leaning on your arm too hard, can set you back for a whole week. Some days you feel fine all morning. Then afternoon hits and suddenly you're dizzy, short of breath, or just wiped out for no clear reason. The little things now feel like big events. A mild cold keeps you in bed for days. A random headache means you need to get it checked out. You start hearing phrases more and more. Monitor it, move carefully, don't push it. What makes this stage so difficult is the uncertainty. You can do everything right. Eat clean, sleep well, exercise regularly. And still, your body might act like it's no longer on your side. It's like you're living with a different version of yourself. Slower, unpredictable, more fragile. And then you realize something. Rest is no longer just how you regain energy. It's how you protect what you have left. You don't sleep to recover, you sleep to maintain. You start weighing every outing, grocery runs, social visits, even just cleaning the kitchen. This shift is hard to accept. No one likes feeling like their body isn't as reliable as it once was, but no one can avoid it either. Still, there's another side to slowing down: clarity. You stop taking your health for granted. You stop spending your energy carelessly. You learn to pay attention to every signal and respond with respect, not stubbornness. You begin living at a new pace, not fast, but steady. You may not recover like before, but you live with more intention. Every step, every decision carries thought. You know your limits, and you know how to protect what truly matters within them. Truth 3, the growing need for help. After 80, something arrives quietly, so quietly that by the time you notice it, it's already there. You start needing help with things that used to be part of your everyday routine. Not because you can't do them anymore, but because now you have to think twice before you do. You don't instinctively reach for the top shelf like you used to. You grip the handrail tighter when stepping down. And sometimes you hesitate behind the wheel not because you forgot how to drive, but because you know the risks aren't small anymore. This change doesn't happen overnight. It builds, quietly, bit by bit, until one day you find yourself wondering, why am I out of breath just bringing groceries from the car to the kitchen? The hard part isn't the action, it's the feeling. People who spend a lifetime taking care of others often struggle to admit they now need care themselves. You start hiding the little things, not telling your kids you almost fell, changing a light bulb even though your shoulder still hurts, skipping a shopping trip because you don't want to ask for a ride. It's not that you don't realize you're getting weaker. It's that you're not used to needing anyone. For many, that feels like losing control. But there's another truth most people don't talk about. Independence after 80 doesn't look the same as it did at 60. It's no longer about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to share the load and being strong enough to do that. I once met an old man named Martin. He lived alone in a small house in the suburbs, used to fix his own plumbing, repaint the fence, clean out the shed all by himself. But one icy winter he slipped and fell. It wasn't serious. Still, after that, he stopped going outside when it snowed. No one pressured him to talk, but one day his grandson brought him dinner and stayed to eat with him. Next time he brought coffee, and gradually, helping Grandpa became an excuse to spend time together. A few months later, Martin told me, "It's been a while since I felt this light inside." Turns out, not everything has to be done alone. That wasn't surrender. That was wisdom. Knowing that accepting help is how you keep living, not how you lose yourself. When you let others support you, carrying a pot of water, driving you to the doctor, changing a light bulb, you're not giving up your dignity. You're preserving your energy for the things that truly matter. And help doesn't always come from people. Sometimes it's the grab bar in the bathroom, the kitchen chair, the note on the fridge reminding you to take your meds. Those things don't make you weaker. They let you keep living actively, safely, and with self-respect. After 80, one of the strongest things you can say is, "I could use a hand." Not because you've lost your ability, but because you've gained the wisdom to know, choosing peace over pushing yourself, choosing safety over pride, choosing connection over silence. That's how you keep going, on your own terms. Truth 4. A presence the world starts to overlook. After the age of 80, there's something hard to say but easy to feel. You start to be noticed less. Not because you've changed, but because the world has changed how it sees you. You haven't disappeared, but sometimes you're no longer counted. You go to a doctor's appointment, but the doctor talks to your son instead of you. You're in line, and the cashier glances past you like you're the space between two real customers. You order a meal, and the server speaks slowly and loudly as if you've forgotten your native language. At first, you shrug it off. Think, it's fine, they don't mean anything by it. But then it happens again, and again, and you start to wonder, have I stopped being seen? You used to set the family's schedule. Used to stand in front of a classroom, lead a team, or hold your first grandchild's hand as they took their first steps. People used to ask your opinion. They used to listen. Now people help without asking. They talk like you're not even there, even when you're sitting right there. What hurts most isn't the lack of respect. It's the quietness of being ignored. No one yells at you. No one tells you to go away. But no one asks what you think either. You're present, but not part of the scene. And that makes you begin to pull back. Not because you want to, but because you're not sure there's still room to step forward. I once met Joanna, 87 years old, a librarian for over 40 years. She still remembers the names of authors she recommended to hundreds of students. Now, she sits in a local book club, listening to younger people talk about literature, and no one asks her what she thinks. They talk, they debate, then they change the subject. After that meeting, I asked her, "How did that feel?" She answered, not with anger, just quietly, "I guess people forget that I used to choose books for this whole town." You are not furniture. You are not background blur in someone else's life. You are still here, and you have the right to take up space. So what should you do? Don't wait for an invitation to speak. Ask questions, share thoughts. Voice your views even if no one opens the door. You don't have to speak loudly, but you do have to speak. Vote, write letters, answer surveys, stay present through action, through choice, through the steady reminder that you're still here and your life still has meaning. The world may be in a hurry. The world may be young, but you are living memory, quiet strength, and irreplaceable wisdom. You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to not shrink back. Don't make yourself smaller. Don't trust others' voices more than your own. You are still here. You still have something to say, and you still deserve to be seen, heard, and respected. Truth 5. The regret of not redefining your purpose. When you enter your 80s, the world around you begins to quiet down. No more meeting alarms. No more early wake-up calls to get to work on time. Even appointments, whether with your doctor or old friends, become fewer and farther between. And then that quiet starts to settle inside you too. You're no longer busy, no longer pulled along by a schedule. You have time now. But with that time comes strange silences, moments where old thoughts creep back in. Not big regrets, but small what-ifs. What if I hadn't skipped that vacation? What if I had said that earlier? What if I had spent more time with that person? They arrive quietly. No one sees them, but you feel them deeply. No one really talks about this, because we usually frame old age in a positive light. Rest, freedom, grandchildren, gardens, and all of that is real and worth celebrating. But alongside it, there's a question no one teaches you how to answer. Now what? When work is gone, and your roles aren't as clear as they used to be, you start to wonder if there's still a reason to get out of bed in the morning. Not because you're tired of life, but because you haven't yet found a new way to live it meaningfully. I once met Helen, 84, a retired nurse. After retiring, she spent a long time feeling no longer useful. But then she started writing handwritten letters to young people in her neighborhood. Letters where she shared how she got through hard times when she was younger. Before long, a whole group of students was asking to get her letters every month. She once said, "I don't work in a hospital anymore, but it turns out I can still help people heal in another way." Purpose doesn't disappear. It just changes shape. Maybe you don't do what you used to, but you can still be present. You may not be as strong as before, but you can still be a steady voice for someone feeling lost. You might not be the decision maker, but you can still pass on wisdom with a simple phrase, "I understand." The most dangerous thing about regret isn't that you were wrong once. It's staying stuck in it, never using it to change what you still can. But when you start to see purpose not as a task to complete, but as a reason to show up here today, things begin to make sense again. Maybe you don't wake up to go to work anymore, but you can still wake up with one question in mind. What's one small thing I can do today to bring light to someone? A phone call, a thank you, a hug, forgiveness, simple things. But things only you can do in your way, that's no longer regret. That's redemption, a quiet, powerful redemption. And it's never too late to begin. Reaching 80 isn't a small milestone. It's the result of decades of real living with deep relationships, invisible losses, difficult changes, and a kind of resilience only those who have been through it can understand. But along with that strength come new challenges. Some creep in slowly without warning. Some arrive bluntly, impossible to ignore. Facing these truths doesn't mean you're weak. It simply means you've come far enough to see life for what it really is, not through stories, not through expectations. And you're still clear-headed enough to know, no matter how much things change, this life is still worth showing up for. So for you, which one of these 5 truths made you pause? Was it the absence of those who were once always there? The way you don't bounce back like you used to, even though you're used to doing things on your own? The discomfort of needing to ask for help when you've been the one supporting others all your life? The distant look in someone's eyes that makes you wonder if you still matter? Or maybe it's those quiet afternoons when the question, "What am I still here for?" echoes clearly in your mind. Whatever it is, I hope you know you're not alone. Not alone in your thoughts, in the silence, or in the unanswered questions. Because the truth is, many others are walking this same path too. And here's what matters most. Even now, you still have the power to choose. Choose to open your heart. Choose to rest without guilt. Choose to seek help without feeling weak. Choose to speak up, even if the world isn't listening. Choose to forgive, not because you've forgotten, but because you deserve peace. And choose to recognize everything you've done, even if no one applauds. This chapter isn't the ending. It's the deepest one, the slowest, but also the most meaningful, where every glance, every word, every moment of your presence carries weight, not because you're doing a lot, but because you're still here, living honestly, feeling deeply, and still making choices. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this video. If something touched you, share it. Just a short line about what you've learned. And if there's something you'll try doing differently, even better. We read every comment, and they give us so much strength to keep going. If you found this video helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with others. Your support doesn't just help us, it helps others hear something real, something needed. See you in the next video, still honest, still kind, and still a space where real things get to be said.